The company that makes your aspirin also created heroin, not as an accident, not as a side experiment, as a product, branded, marketed, sold in pharmacies, recommended by doctors, and for more than a decade, prescribed to children as cough medicine. The advertisements still exist. The medical journal endorsements still exist. The sales records still exist. The internal correspondence still exists. This is not a story about one bad decision. It's a story about a company that knew, kept selling, and used the most trusted institution in society to do it. Trust. Before this story ends, you'll understand why that word is the most dangerous thing a company can sell you. In the 1890s, tuberculosis was killing 1 in 7 people in the Western world. There was no antibiotic, no cure. Tuberculosis patients coughed for years, sometimes decades, before the disease finished them. Children died from it. Adults died from it. Entire families were destroyed by it. And because the cough was the most visible, most agonizing symptom, stopping it became medicine's most urgent practical problem. Morphine existed. It worked. It suppressed coughing, reduced pain, and made the final stages of tuberculosis bearable. But it was also profoundly addictive. Physicians knew this. The public knew this. Morphine dependency was a recognized medical condition by the 1870s, and the patients who developed it, soldiers, cancer patients, tuberculosis sufferers, faced a second crisis layered on top of the first. What medicine needed was a drug that worked like morphine, but didn't create addiction. In 1895, a chemist at Bayer named Heinrich Drieser began experimenting with diacetyl morphine, a compound first synthesized in 1874 but never brought to market. His early tests produced results that looked, on the surface, exactly like what medicine had been waiting for. The compound suppressed coughs. Patients reported feeling stronger, more capable, more energetic. In German, the word for that feeling was heroisch, heroic. Bayer named the drug heroin. It was a trademark. In 1898, Bayer introduced heroin to the medical market. The launch was not quiet. Free samples went to physicians across Europe and North America. More than 20 countries received shipments within the first year. Clinical results published in journals, findings presented at conferences. The message was explicit. Heroin was a safer, non-addictive substitute for morphine. By 1899, Bayer was producing over a ton of heroin per year. The medical community received it as a breakthrough. When Bayer said non-addictive, physicians believed them. The company had given medicine aspirin just 2 years earlier. Their credibility was at its peak. If Bayer said it was safe, that carried weight. Mothers gave it to their children for coughs. Physicians prescribed it for tuberculosis, bronchitis, and pneumonia. Pharmacies stocked it over the counter. It appeared in medical reference books as a standard treatment. Trust had been established. The product was in the market. What happened next is where history stops being a story about science and starts being a story about strategy. Bayer didn't just introduce heroin, they sold it like a modern pharmaceutical company sells a blockbuster drug. Sales representatives, called detail men, visited physicians' offices with samples and promotional literature. Medical journal ads described heroin as free from the disagreeable after effects of morphine. One Bayer promotional pamphlet specifically recommended heroin for children suffering from coughs, calling it particularly suitable for children. Particularly suitable for children. That phrase was an official Bayer marketing material, not a misprint, not an isolated case, a documented feature of how the company positioned the product. In the United States, Bayer ran ads in mainstream publications, Heroin in the same catalogs as aspirin, same distribution networks, same institutional confidence. The Boston Medical and Surgical Journal, one of the most respected medical publications in America at the time, published clinical endorsements of heroin as a therapeutic agent. The Journal of the American Medical Association featured positive reports. These were not paid advertisements in the modern sense. They were clinical findings submitted by physicians who had used Bayer heroin on their patients and reported the results. The results initially looked good. Patients coughed less. They felt better. They came back for more. By the time Congress passed the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act in 1914, an estimated 200,000 Americans had developed heroin use disorders, most of them people who first encountered the drug as patients or as children given cough syrup by parents who trusted Bayer's label. The first formal warning appeared in 1899, 1 year after launch. A physician named Solman published observations that some patients were developing dependency. His findings were specific. Patients who stopped the drug experienced withdrawal symptoms consistent with morphine withdrawal. The non-addictive claim was, at minimum, premature. Solman wasn't alone. By 1902, multiple physicians across Europe and North America had independently reported the same patterns. Patients prescribed heroin for coughs were coming back. Not for coughs, for heroin. Children who had been given heroin syrup were showing symptoms their parents didn't recognize and couldn't explain. The journals that had published Bayer's endorsements began publishing the counter-evidence. The New York Medical Journal ran reports in 1902. The British Medical Journal followed. The picture was becoming clear. Heroin wasn't non-addictive. In some respects, it was more addictive than morphine. It reached the brain faster, hit harder. The dependency turned quicker. The question was not whether Bayer's scientists saw this literature. They did. Their own internal researchers were among the most sophisticated pharmaceutical scientists in the world. The addiction reports were not subtle. They ran in the same journals that had carried Bayer's promotional studies. When did Bayer know? According to historical records, the company had access to the addiction literature by 1902 at the latest. Their medical consultants reviewed these journals as routine. What they did with that knowledge is the next part of this story. In 1899, a physician named Horatio Wood published something important. He noticed the dose had to keep going up for heroin to stay effective. In pharmacology, escalating tolerance is one of the primary signs of addiction. Wood was explicit. Experimentation, he wrote, was not adequate to warrant the conclusion that heroin was not addiction-producing. Bayer's response was to continue distribution. In 1902, 4 years after launch, the medical literature reached a turning point. A French physician named Gerigi published findings that should have ended the campaign. His documentation was specific, damning. Physicians prescribing heroin weren't curing addiction. They were creating a new one. Gerigi had a name for what he was seeing. Heroinists. Patients who had never touched morphine were now dependent on the drug marketed as morphine's safe alternative. Then he found something worse. Withdrawal from heroin was more painful than withdrawal from morphine. The drug sold as a safer substitute was producing a more severe dependency than the one it was supposed to replace. Published in medical journals. The same journals Bayer's detail men read. The same journals that had carried Bayer's endorsements 4 years earlier. Bayer didn't update their marketing materials. They didn't issue a safety advisory. They didn't contact the physicians to whom they had distributed free samples. They continued production. In 1903, an American physician named Petty documented 150 consecutive drug addiction cases from his practice. 8 of those patients were addicted to heroin. 3 of the 8 had never used morphine. They became addicted through heroin alone, through medicine prescribed by a doctor who trusted the label that said non-addictive. 3 patients who would never have been addicts if not for the product Bayer was still selling. The evidence wasn't hidden. It was accumulating publicly in peer-reviewed journals, in the exact professional literature that Bayer monitored and used to promote its own products. By 1905, heroin addicts had become as numerous as morphine addicts in the populations physicians were treating. The drug introduced specifically to reduce narcotic dependency had produced an equivalent dependency of its own. Here is what the historical record shows about Bayer's response to all of this. They kept marketing heroin as children's cough medicine until 1912. 14 years after launch, 10 years after Gerage documented heroinists, 9 years after Petty found patients addicted by heroin alone. Bayer's position throughout this period, documented in their promotional materials, was that the problem was patient misuse, not the product. Physicians who prescribed correctly, patients who followed instructions, would not face the problems being reported. That framing, the problem is misuse, not the product, will be familiar to anyone who watched the opioid crisis of the 21st century. Not a coincidence. In the 1990s, Purdue Pharma introduced OxyContin, their central marketing claim, a non-addictive alternative to existing painkillers. When addiction reports accumulated in the medical literature, their institutional response was the same: patient misuse, not the product. According to a Stat News analysis published in 2020, the 1890s and 1990s opioid crises were both characterized by the unopposed amplification of the benefits of opioids and the transformation of physicians into unabashed cheerleaders. Same language, same strategy, 100 years apart. In 1914, the United States Congress passed the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act, the first federal law regulating narcotics. Bayer had already lost the trademark. Under the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, Germany surrendered intellectual property rights as war reparations. Bayer lost the trademarks for both aspirin and heroin in the United States and the United Kingdom. The word heroin, coined in Bayer's marketing department, passed into the public domain. What it named did not. To understand the scale of what Bayer had sold into, by 1900, an estimated 300,000 Americans were already dependent on opioids, primarily morphine and opium. That was the crisis Bayer was promising to solve. That was the market their non-addictive claim was designed to capture. They didn't solve it. They made it worse. By the 1920s, heroin addiction had become a global public health problem. In the United States alone, estimates place the number of heroin-dependent individuals at several 100,000. The majority of them people who first encountered the drug as patients, or as children given cough syrup by well-meaning parents who trusted Bayer's label. In February 1924, Carlton Simon, Special Deputy Police Commissioner of New York City, reported that 94% of criminal drug addicts arrested in the city used heroin regularly. Bayer's product had become the defining substance of an entire generation of addiction. The drug moved from regulated pharmaceutical to controlled substance to prohibited substance across much of the world within a generation. The transition wasn't smooth. Heroin had been distributed so widely through legitimate pharmaceutical channels that the infrastructure for illegal distribution was largely already in place. The supply chains Bayer had built to distribute heroin to pharmacies across more than 20 countries did not dissolve when the drug was banned. They adapted. The waves of heroin addiction that moved through American cities in the 1950s, the 1960s, the 1970s, and beyond trace their origins in part to the pharmaceutical marketing decisions made by a German company in 1898. Bayer did not intend this outcome. Intent in corporate history is rarely the relevant question. The relevant question is what a company knew, when they knew it, and what they chose to do with that knowledge. By 1902, Bayer had the data. The product remained on the market for over a decade after those first warnings appeared. During that decade, millions of patients, including children, were introduced to heroin through legitimate medical channels by physicians who trusted Bayer's marketing materials, the ones that said non-addictive. The trust was institutional. The harm was real. The documentation exists. Bayer created heroin. Big Tobacco used doctors to make cigarettes feel safe. Big Sugar paid Harvard to clear sugar and blame fat. 3 different industries. 3 different products. 3 different centuries. 1 playbook. In each case, the sequence was the same. A company identified a product that could generate significant profit. Early evidence emerged suggesting the product carried risk. The company's response was not to investigate openly and inform the public. It was to use the credibility of trusted institutions, medicine, science, academia, to manufacture confidence while the evidence against them accumulated. Bayer used pharmaceutical science. The tobacco industry used medicine. The sugar industry used academic research. In each case, the institution being used didn't always know it was being used. Some participants were deceived. Some were paid. Some simply worked inside systems that rewarded silence and made disclosure difficult. What these cases share isn't a conspiracy. It's something simpler. When the cost of admitting a problem is higher than the cost of delaying it, companies delay. No coordination required. No villain needed. The structure does the work. And the next time a company calls something safe before they fully understand it, somewhere in a journal, or a trial, or an internal memo, the first warning is already being written. In 1898, Bayer introduced heroin to the world and called it a miracle. They had clinical data. They had physician endorsements. They had a trusted brand. They also had access to an emerging body of evidence that suggested the miracle was not what they had claimed. They sold the miracle anyway. Not because the people at Bayer were uniquely evil, because the system they operated in rewarded selling the miracle and punished questioning it. That system did not end with heroin. It did not end with tobacco. It did not end with sugar. It is the system that decides what gets marketed as safe before any